Welcome everyone to today's webinar, From APIs to RPA, a crash course on building powerful healthcare integrations. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'll walk through just a few quick housekeeping instructions. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, you can type those into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. And finally, if at any time you have trouble with the audio or video, please try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box, and we're here to help. With that, I am thrilled to introduce today's speakers. We are joined by Gabriella Rosenblatt, Solution Delivery Lead at Notable, and Lyle Restrepo-Wilson, Product Delivery Lead at Notable. Gabriella is a seasoned healthcare leader with a background in promoting operational efficiency in multiple healthcare settings. Currently at Notable, Gabriella plays a pivotal role in overseeing Oracle Health intake solution implementations and has successfully deployed patient intake automation at leading healthcare organizations across the country. Lyle is a health tech veteran with a decade of experience helping organizations implement applications and programs within their systems to create efficiencies and improve patient outcomes. At Notable, Lyle oversees integrations teams that orchestrate the work needed for successful solution implementations and has deployed Notable's solution to a variety of EHR ecosystems across the country. Gabriella and Lyle, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to get to be here and a great pleasure to get to co-host this with Lyle as we together have gotten to build teams around integrations and have lots of scars and skills to share with you today that we've learned and have put into great best practices and playbooks. So without further ado, let's head into some of our material here. So before we get started, a little bit about how do we work with integrations, what's our background, and what are we doing on a daily basis to continue to learn about what is available from an AI perspective. Here at Notable, we serve over 32 million patients. We're automating workflows across the entire care continuum. We are consistently looking for areas of opportunities to partner with our customers to make their digital experiences and patient automations the best and world-class. So as you see here, we have several partners that have been our thought collaborators as we work towards optimal integrations and digital experiences. And we have had the honor to get to partner with a lot of these customers through their portals and through their partner systems, through vendor applications such as the Oracle partnership, through the partnership network, Athena Marketplace, as well as Epic. So talking a little bit more about what are some of our solutions that we support here. On this next slide, we've got an overview of what Notable does, as well as some of our leading elements of our integrations. So from a platform perspective, we automate several different solutions that are ones that engage patients from the time of check-in all the way through them being reminded of care outcomes and gaps in that they need to fulfill, need to schedule new appointments, and ultimately making it easier for those patients to get the care that they need. That requires a series of not just a great user interface, but very important, many different aspects of integration. One thing that we have learned together is that there is no right or wrong way to build an integration strategy, but there is many aspects of it that will help you come up with something that is going to bring the most efficiency and optimization when you're looking at what are all the different types of AI that I could use to get to the most ideal outcome for what my organization wants in this moment, and how can I continue to build and scale on that. So let's take a look at why is it so important to get this integration strategy right. Everyone can start with some very basic integration models. Lyle, in the next couple slides, is going to go through what each of those look like and what all our options are. But one key thing we wanted to ground with was it is important to get this right as automation and digital technology become the forefront of consumerism across every single one of our industries here. and the healthcare industry is expecting this. We work with several of our partners that have crafted some really great user experiences and some really great digital front door strategies. However, what we've seen is if the integrations that are supporting those strategies or those automation efforts are not backed with what is going to allow for that information to get from the patient into the system or from the system to the patient, it won't work. Just as if you go to a fast food restaurant and you're ordering that chicken sandwich ahead of time on your iPhone, it could be the best user experience that you ever had and make sure you can choose all your toppings. If your order doesn't get to where it needs to go and your chicken sandwich isn't there when you drive through the drive-through, it's going to end in a mistrust from you as a consumer, and your staff are not going to feel the benefit and most likely are actually going to have added work on their plate and have to deal with that dissatisfaction from their consumer. So this is why this is the forefront of what we think about when we are continuously looking at how do we optimize and how do we take advantage of all of the available opportunities and options when it comes to integrations. Something that I know coming into Notable, I was not aware of all of the different types and what are some of the pros and what are some of the cons. So to help us learn a little bit more about that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Lyle, to teach us.
Thank you, Gabby. So when we look at the different types of integration, it's very difficult to do everything with a single form in healthcare. That single source of integration in and out of systems doesn't exist yet. But over time, as different technologies have emerged, that ability to cover integrations over a wider sets of data has become more efficient and has continued to improve with the introduction of different technologies. So organizations have relied on some of these integrations like HL7 for a while, for over 30 years. Whereas newer technologies like RPA or even FHIR APIs can still sometimes be considered novel for organizations and to their integrations repertoire, like the tools that they have in their toolkit to get the job done. So having a really robust framework around these different types of integrations is really important. And having a partner who has the flexibility to navigate these different types in healthcare, who understands the complexities of there not being a single source of truth for integration, is really, really beneficial to make sure that you're able to pursue your desired outcomes together and leverage your patient's healthcare data to get there. As Gabby mentioned, our digital transformation in healthcare can still sometimes sort of miss the mark in places on hitting the ROI, on having the bidirectional engagement that we want in the data. But the more flexible you can be with your integrations, the more you can close those gaps and the more you can open yourselves up to achieving your desired outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about each of these different types of integrations and what they look like and maybe what some of the good use cases are for them or where they're used in healthcare today and what that looks like. I want to start off with basics as I get into this, definitions for folks on the call who may not be as familiar with some of these, depending on where you're coming from within your organization. So for RPA, let's start with the standard definition. RPA stands for robotic process automation. It's essentially the codification of a series of steps in a process that a human might do, turned into some type of software program that can run on top of or inside of your applications. It's a tool that continues to evolve, but it's quietly been around for almost as long as some of these other integration methods we're going to talk about, dating back to the early 2000s. And in this newer evolving age where AI is a hot button topic for everybody, people are asking, what's my AI strategy? Where can I use it? The evolution of the tools and the systems behind AI that are driving improvements are contributing to what RPA looks like. As we look at image recognition models that are improving, as we look at deterministic behaviors being able to be parsed out through LLMs, all of those things can contribute to the capabilities, the accuracy, and the ability to handle more complex tasks for RPA. So what is it good at, though, today, especially, right? Like RPA is really good at getting at those hard to reach places in healthcare and are ideal for areas where integration methods don't exist otherwise for your discrete and non-discrete data. And where maybe a standard or a specification does exist, doesn't really have the complete coverage that you might want or translate to what your outcomes are trying to achieve through that integration, which we'll get to in a little bit here. So some examples of RPA today and where those are used, things like reading and writing custom registration fields is pretty common. Maybe there's an additional set of fields that you might care about that's not out of the box for your EHR vendor. Maybe writing responses back on a patient questionnaire into a tool is not something that there's another integration method for, and you want to reduce your MA efforts in the clinic by transcribing maybe paper forms or having the patient fill it out once they get into the office. And so using RPA to try to write back those responses. Those are some examples of things where this can be a really, really powerful and useful tool. Like an example that we've seen in the past is, maybe you're an organization that has a new partnership with the VA systems for referrals, right? And you want to capture in registration a lot of additional fields around military status beyond just like were they in the military or not? Yes, no, or are they active duty or retired? Maybe you want to capture years of service, different types of branches, and you want to expand that subset so that you can have more information in your partnership with the VA. That might be an example where RPA can really be useful to achieve those outcomes, make sure that you're presenting information to patients and then getting it back into your system when there's updates to be made. So as we get into the next kind of topic of things around interfaces, those standards are out there and they're improving more and more over time, but they often fail. And this is where RPA really becomes most valuable in writing data back into our systems. There's a lot of reading of information out of our systems via APIs today in healthcare, but the writing back and updating of information is lacking at times. So we'll get into those a little bit, but that's really the context in which RPA can be a really valuable tool in your ecosystem of integrations. So getting to our first interface that we'll talk about here is APIs. APIs stand for Application Programming Interface, and these are essentially intermediaries between applications that allow them to communicate using the same language. So it essentially means that it allows them to share data back and forth using the same structure and controlled mechanisms. And APIs are kind of the newest kid on the block in healthcare as far as integrations go. FHIR APIs, which is the often talked about standard, were first only introduced in 2011 and really have only expanded in the last 7 years to have a wider area of coverage since version 3 in 2017. So it's still a very new standard of integration that is often dictated by and updated by regulatory bodies under the guidance of ONC and the 21st Century CARES Act. So as some of these different regulations come out and more requirements are defined, those standards are improving. These can be like an incredibly powerful tool in your toolkit in integrations and very valuable when they're available. But when they're available is that critical piece that you need to consider depending on what you're trying to achieve. So they're especially valuable and critical, I would even argue, in real-time situations where updates in real time are really critical and important for quality of care and a patient experience. So an example for that might be eligibility checking with payer systems on a patient checking in. And that would be like a third-party app going out to, Availity to check, is this insurance valid? Can we actually bill them on this based off of what they've given me? Other examples of that might be, posting a payment back into the system from a third-party vendor if they're looking at their copay ahead of time in a intake experience. Maybe it's checking in patients once they arrive via an API so that they can skip the front desk. Or in urgent care needs, right? Like maybe it's a patient walking in and trying to get scheduled in real time and then also fill out some forms and get that information back into the EHR in real time, right? Any of those situations where you're very time sensitive can be very valuable for APIs and be great use cases for where you really would want to implement things. There's a lot of other examples out there of APIs as well, and the areas that they're continuing to expand to include like clinical content reads and even writes in some situations, though that's often a gap. Looking at observations and conditions for patients, whether that's encounter diagnoses or problem list diagnoses, maybe it's labs or social history on the observation front. And demographic details as well can be really valuable and usable via APIs. And as these standards evolve, as I've mentioned, more and more is becoming available on them, which is really, really a great thing. And so in a perfect world, everything would run on an API because of how efficient they are, because of how real time they are, with robust specifications defining everything that's available for them and can be done with them, that you may want to use in your systems and in your engagements. But there's still a lot to be desired by these FHIR API standards today and by the regulatory bodies that are governing them, like we mentioned. And in the absence of some of those regulatory demands and implementations of the specifications by organizations and where those match up, in the absence of that, some vendors out there have gone forward with creating custom proprietary APIs that help to fill those gaps. So when you look across different EHR vendors, many of them have these private API ecosystems. But I think the important things to consider in those, even though they extend the availability and functionality that APIs offer in healthcare, is that the access to these can sometimes be gatekept, the costs can sometimes be higher, and what it might look like to integrate with and maintain them can also vary widely across these organizations. So those are some important things to consider when looking at the differences between sometimes those regulatory body demanded APIs that are in existence and some of these private APIs that are out there in the ecosystems around that. So the next interface, the kind of the OG grandfather of healthcare integrations is HL7. And I think just kind of going back even deeper into definitions a little bit, probably, HL7 stands for Health Level 7. I think that's important to call out. It's actually the nonprofit that develops and maintains a lot of these standards for exchanging electronic healthcare data. And people will often refer to HL7 as a short form to describe the interfaces that we'll talk about here. But these are really more commonly known as HL7 v2 interfaces at this point. They were introduced in the late 70s, so they've been around, as I mentioned, for over 35 years at this point. So they're a longtime standard in the healthcare industry as those were introduced and have been adopted. And we just talked about FHIR APIs a little bit. Interesting factoid, HL7 is the same organization that helps to define those standards that exist within the FHIR framework as kind of like the next evolution beyond these HL7 v2 interfaces. And the difference I would call out between those, because they're kind of maintained and specifications are defined within the same organization in these two different interfaces, is really that the difference between APIs and HL7 v2 is essentially a communication paradigm, where APIs are synchronous, and that means that the communication between systems is happening bidirectionally in real time. HL7 v2s follow a little bit more of a like publish and then subscribe model, where the feedback and acknowledgement of communication between systems is a little bit more linear. And it's a little bit of a nuanced difference, but those differences, while minor to us, on the human level, most of the time, can actually impact the speed of communication in a way that may be a consideration for some of your workflows, depending on what you're trying to do. The slight differences may be in that lag between publishing and acknowledging versus bidirectional communication that allows things to proceed forward can make a difference. So when you're looking at, there's an API for this, there's HL7 v2 for this, which one should we use? Those might be considerations that are worth discussing with people. So as I mentioned, this is kind of the OG integration method. It's truly omnipresent throughout healthcare, whether that be around exchanging data between systems or doing device integration so that monitoring information can flow into your EHR or whatever it might be. While it is an older standard at this point, having been created over 35 years ago, it's still very reliable and organizations are very comfortable with it and commonly use it for things like admission, discharge, and transfer notifications, referrals, orders, appointments, documents. The list goes on and on and on. There's really a wide coverage of availability using the specifications here. Notes is another example of this where, in a workflow can be very valuable. For example, maybe you have a patient form that you want someone to complete before a clinical form before they come in, and you want to compile their responses into an HPI that gets routed to your EHR as a starting point for the physician to engage it with that patient on. Or maybe you have a discharge summary that you want to send to a downstream system that's managing follow-up care or long-term care around something following an admission. So those are examples of where like a notes interface really comes in handy, but across all of these different types that I've just described, orders, referrals, HL7 V2 interfaces are very present and valuable. And so while they're well known and in use across healthcare, they're a safe bet for your organization to generally implement. They can also come with some higher costs to your organization to set up and maintain compared to some of the other types of integrations that exist out there. And so as you're working through your framework of decision making, that's just an important thing to keep in mind. And last but not least is SFTPs, the kind of the most simple of the bunch. SFTP stands for Secure File Transfer Protocol. Some of you may know about this. Some of you may know about FTPs, which are just file transfer protocols. The SFTP version is the evolution upon that again has really only been around since around the 2000s. So it does exactly what it sounds like. It securely transfers files between systems, between a client and a server. It uses a secure shell connection for authentication and data encryption, which is what allows it to have that security behind it, and is what allowed for it to be adopted in healthcare more and more over the last 20 years, as obviously security around our patient data is a critical thing for us. So SFTPs are really ideal for exchanging files of data at the simplest level, whether those be CSVs of large data sets or simply an operational report you want to share with partners or across an organization. Since it's encrypted, safe, and secure, it ensures that we can exchange that data back and forth quite efficiently and easily in like a positive way for healthcare. It's not complicated to set up. It's for either the sending or receiving organization. So it's usually a pretty easy and light lift for exchanging data between people. But there's always the shortcoming of SFTP is it's just sending data. It's not doing anything with the data. So they're really good for these formatted reports and things that you want to do on a regular scheduled cadence, where maybe some downstream process is taking place, some type of ETL or extract, transform, and load of that data to do something with it. So example is it's really good for foundational data sets that you might want to do something with, like patient lists, whether that be like a scheduled discharge list that you want to send to an organization for follow-up care, an at-risk population you want to send to a vendor for care gap outreaches, or a list of patients with prior balances that you want to send to a third party who's going to coordinate prior balance collection for you. Those are all examples of where if you have a report or a dashboard on your side that lists out a set of data or a set of patients, it can be really valuable to exchange that with third-party vendors who can then transform that information and create a patient experience or some bidirectional interaction with that data. So a lot of information, a lot of different, these are just 4 core types. There are other, more nuanced methods of integration that exist, but those are the 4 core to call out, I would say, in healthcare. And how do you choose which of these to use when you're looking at this large ecosystem? How do you know where you should fall? How do you know, how do you ensure that your integration strategy and framework can be performative for you and your organization? You want to make sure throughout this that you're curating a system when you're building your integrations that can adapt to your need without sacrificing a best-in-class level of reliability in healthcare, right? Because our providers, our clinicians, our patients' experiences all depend on that. And so how do you do that? I'm going to hand it back over to Gabby to talk a little bit more around frameworks and decision-making around integrations.
So many choices to choose from. Yep. Lyle put it perfectly. We're lucky that we have the opportunity to choose, to make choices, and to build. I think the magic behind building an integration strategy is that it's not one size fits all. Every organization is going to have different needs, is going to have different resources that are going to shape the path for what and how do they build this strategy. So let's take a look at what we found to be a best practice core playbook for how do we put this together and how do we make sure we don't miss anything when we're getting started to choose how we're going to integrate. So from the very beginning, simple assessment. Let's take a look at what do we have to work with? What are our tools at this moment? What does our team look like? What are our resources? How quickly are we trying to iterate and implement on this specific strategy and get connected with a system of truth? Next, let's take a look at what are our goals? What do we want to accomplish here? And how much of this do we want to be end-to-end automation versus is this something that we simply want to make sure that the patient can see on their end, but it doesn't necessarily need to feed back anywhere into a system of truth. Maybe this is something we just need to pull out of the EHR and feed to the patient in that similar vein there. Let's take a look at how are we going to determine success based off of what our end result is there. And then next, taking a look and evaluating and trying to remember all of those options that Lyle just educated us on, what we have, what are the pros, what are the cons, and going through each one of those options that we have available to decide which are going to be the best for this specific point in time. And then next, we have the opportunity to do iteration here. We don't have to go with all integration methods all at one time. We can start with something simple and build on something that is going to get us to that full automation that might take a little bit more time or might have more assets available if we wait a little bit longer based off of how APIs are developing or what might be available from a partner or through a open source for getting different forms of integrations through your systems. And then lastly, it's just monitoring and optimizing. That this is something that is core to success that we have seen here, which is once we've implemented, we don't really just set it and let it go. We're continuing to watch, how is this choice that we've made working for us? And then the great news is if it's not, we can add in another option. We have a fallback. A lot of the times we are already got our plan B in mind. Maybe that plan B is to see how well we can get high coverage, or maybe it's us wanting to move and leverage less resources or something that won't be as high of cost. So we know our end game is going to be to switch to a different form of integrations. So now that we talked through a little bit about what's the thought process, what are some of the key components, let's put this into action and let's talk through how would we deploy a specific strategy. So here we have a scenario, an example. Let's pretend we are a 150-bed hospital. We've got an Oracle Health system of truth from an EHR perspective, and we want to implement a digital front door strategy. We want our patients to be able to use automated tools to be able to complete their registration, their clinical forms, check themselves in, make their payments, and then also close any gaps in care. We want one source system. How do we get there? So let's start with our step one, which was assessment. So some of the key things we're going to look at here as this organization, we're going to say our IT resourcing at the moment. Our IT resources are tied up on other projects. We don't have a lot of people to commit time and their efforts towards continuously monitoring, putting things together, troubleshooting, training, testing. So we know that we want to go with something that is seamless, something that's going to have a powerful integration that isn't going to take a lot of maintenance behind the scenes. Next is budget. Some forms of integration are costly. This might come with what does it cost to have the option to utilize those integration methods. Maybe that's a partner system that you need to pay to be a part of, or maybe it is the cost associated with having system accounts within your environment. And we want to take a look at what does our environment look like today? Will there be cost implications that are associated with this? And what's going to be the best outcome for us there? And then finally, time to value. This is a big one. We want to make sure that our projects are very thorough, but at the same time, we want to ensure that what we're doing, we can see value as quickly as possible. And that might lead us to our second kind of key component here, which is let's make sure we understand what are our goals and how are we going to define success within this project. So we know here we want to have the a world-class patient experience. We want them to engage digitally with this tool. And a big pain point for our organization is decreasing the amount of time our staff are spending on calls. So we want to look at how is this tool going to allow patients to complete elements of their digital check-in or engaging in care all through automation. We don't want to have more manual work that needs to be done by our staff. So we know here that this is going to require some integrations that are going to be quite seamless and bi-directional in nature. And then lastly, we know we want to automate that patient check-in. Our wait lines, our queues that we have formed are out the door. And we know that we want to get patients to have the option that have been here before. This is their second appointment in a week. We want them to be able to come into the clinic and then sit down and wait for their provider because their information has not changed since their past visit. So now let's evaluate what's going to help us get to our goal and which integrations are we going to use. So we're going to take a look. We know here we heard from Lyle the power of the APIs. They're fast, they're efficient, tried and true, and it's something that is very consistent as well. What you do for one, when you're going to scale, you do for another. So we're going to look for APIs where they are available. We want to use this for the majority of what we can for our scope. But we also recognize that there aren't APIs available for everything. For each EHR system, it's going to be different. So we want to say, what is the delta there? There are some very specific fields in our registration conversation that we need to have the patient update and engage with in order to allow them to digitally check in. We don't want to cause more downstream implications on our healthcare system where maybe we don't collect the correct insurance information or have the patient miss out on paying a copay because we're getting them in the door faster. So we do want to be mindful that our workflows and our change management is in line with this digital efficiency that we're looking to provide as well. So this is where we're going to look at what form of integration is going to really help us fill the gaps. So here, HL7, most likely an option. But if we're looking at time to value, and we know we want to go live in a few weeks here, HL7, building out those feeds, doing that test, and seeing where there might be additional gaps that we can't see at the very beginning of the project isn't going to be our best option for this specific moment. So we're going to look towards a robotic processing automation to fill in where are those hard to reach places where we know those specific insurance fields that we need to make sure that we validate, or we need to make sure that we address whether this visit is associated with an auto accident, something that's very simple but very powerful to know who do we bill, how do we bill, when do we bill. These are all very key components here that RPA will allow us to ensure we get to the right field and we are updating that information just as a staff member would be today. And then lastly, we want to evaluate from a source system perspective. We mentioned those APIs here, but what's going to be best for our environment? So adding in system credentials to allow for those RPA system accounts would be very similar, we know, to what our staff is utilizing today. So this is something that would be very doable and something that will help us here along our integration strategy. So now we've chosen what are going to be our first phase integration options within our strategy. Now let's talk about how do we put together a timeline and how do we put together a phase plan. From a perspective of scars and skills, when it comes to iteration, when you can do something that is taking a core piece of what you're going to implement and do it in an isolated environment, you allow for just that growth and area of opportunity for you to see and learn without causing incidents that are going to be escalated across an organization-wide implementation. So from a phased perspective, we found it's really great, especially when you're looking at integrations and you're sending in different forms of connection to these systems. Start small and iterate fast. So we know that we want to get those APIs connected. This is one that's going to build our foundation. And then from there, let's start with what RPA fields do we want to iterate first. Let's finish out what does it take to touch the full registration component, and then we'll move on to clinical, or then we'll move on to payment collection. Let's see if we can go in chunks. Then we know that we have really come to something really, really great when it comes to that finished product in our isolated showcase first beginning phase of our project. And then from there, we know that that's probably not going to be where we stop. There's going to be additional things that we want to do. We want to eventually make sure that we don't have to continue to add in more and more system accounts to manage a bunch of different, robots per se in your system environment. So we know that we want to either continue to transition to more APIs as they become available, or look to transition onto an SFTP feed or an HL7 feed, once we're already seeing our return on going live quickly with our initial scope. And we have that time to take a moment, relish in what we've done here from an optimal integration, and get live on something that's a little bit more seamless. And then lastly, we continue to monitor. We know that we've gotten to a point where we've got something good, but we're always looking for how do we iterate. One of our pillars at Notable is to iterate with zeal. So this is at the forefront for Lyle and I when it comes to monitoring and optimizing something. We're always saying, could that be better? Do we stop here? How do we make sure that we feel fully confident we're doing the absolute best we can to get that information exactly where it needs to go?
Yeah, exactly, Gabby. And when we look at iteration, it's so important in healthcare. You can't really get the outcomes you want from day one in most things that you implement in healthcare, right? So having an alignment around what integration looks like and what that roadmap looks like and how you monitor and optimize what you're doing is really, really important. And that kind of like transitions us into the all right, wow, lots of chat, lots of info, a lot of big details. What are the key takeaways, right? Like, if nothing else, what should I remember or take away from this time with Gabby and I? And so just running through these and talking about these a little bit, these are kind of what we think of as the 4 key takeaways around integrations. As I mentioned before, there's really no single solution that's going to solve all your problems. There's not a panacea for integrations in healthcare. No one's quite figured out how to do everything via one method yet. The requirements aren't all built out for all of that in anything that would be a good candidate. And then how organizations or EHR systems have implemented even against the requirements and specifications that exist today can look very different and inconsistent. So there's not one thing that's going to solve all your problems. And so when it comes to integration, flexibility is really key. Having the ability and having a good partner who can navigate that flexibility with you is really, really important. The second thing is if it's not bidirectional, it's not integrated. Really a very simplistic concept, but a really important one. If you are creating different types of manual steps through your integration than what exists today, you're not really doing integration. You're not really having that bidirectional work. Integrations and systems around that should support to reduce the amount of work we have and push electronic healthcare ecosystems along and move them forward, right? So bidirectional is really, really important in that. It's a two-way street. The third of which is that continuous learning and iteration, as we've mentioned a couple of times, is really, really important. It's acceptable and okay to iterate and improve upon what you have and go back to the drawing board when new things become available. Just make sure that you have a shared understanding, I would say, within your organization about what that looks like, what that roadmap can look like, and how you work your way into the desired outcomes that you want to achieve through that iteration. As we mentioned, requirements and specifications of modern APIs and even of like HL7, they don't always cover 100% of what you might need as an organization, right? Within healthcare, we all have different objectives and different outcomes that might be nuanced around patient care. While patient care is at the center, there might be little variances here and there. And so it's hard for these interface or other specifications to cover the gambit of all of that. And so around that flexibility and iteration and continuous learning, some of the things that are really important are like, what types of trade-offs are you willing to make when you're looking at integrations? Are you willing to forgo having integration to a specific field and maybe removing that from the things that matter to you as an organization if it's in service of greater efficiency and greater integration across your other 9 out of 10 fields for a given workflow or for a given patient experience, right? So what are those trade-offs as you're looking at iteration and continuous learning that you're willing to make knowing that there's some of these gaps that exist out there. And then lastly, leverage the frameworks that we kind of talked about. Leverage a framework that works for you as an organization about how you make decisions around vendors and what integration looks like for you. And leverage vendors who have healthcare expertise. This is really important because of these nuances and because of the things that are gaps in healthcare and integrations. It's really valuable to have a partner who understands those and understands what the roadblocks might be in the way of getting towards your outcomes and achieving what you want to achieve. So work with a vendor who understands that complexity in healthcare and is willing to work alongside you as a partner in it and not try to funnel you into their specific model only of how integrations might look.
Yeah. And now armed with this knowledge, feel free to share what you learned with them of, I don't think that's the most optimal outcome for us. How can we look at different optionality and put together something that might be iterative and what's best for us in this moment.
All right. So with that, I think we will turn it over to you all for some questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Lyle and Gabriella, for that great information. We have time for a few quick questions here. So the first one is, with recent security events happening in the industry, can you tell us a bit more about the risks of RPA?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one on. So I think it's really important to demystify RPA in many ways. I think a lot of folks have concerns around it at times because they maybe don't understand fully what it is and what it does. And an important call out around that is that RPA is really just mimicking the steps that a normal human user would take. But with extra checks and security around that too, which is a positive gain actually if it's implemented the right way. So obviously it's really important to understand your vendors and how they use RPA, what type of scrutiny they apply to it, what are their safety mechanisms that are in place. But really, usually in an RPA workflow, a bot, as they're often called, and we sometimes get funny questions around where do you store your bots? You know, they're not physical entities yet, right? Thanks AI, but you know, losing track of myself a little bit, but you know, with jokes, but the access that these bots have to your systems is no different than any other users you might have in your system, right? They're accessing your networks over VPNs, just the way a remote user would from home. They're accessing things with the right level of security around what they have access to, what their security might look like within a system. And so all of that is controllable the same way you would control a similar user within your system who's doing that work otherwise, right? And the other thing that's really important to call out around safety around RPA is a concept around validation, right? So like what are the security measures is one thing, but what is the validation that organizations do to make sure that they're doing the work that they say they're doing via RPA? That's where RPA can actually be even more valuable than a human because it's checking its own work. Is there a process that it's going through to validate, yes, I planned to do this thing, and yes, I did this thing? Sometimes a human in the course of their busy days can make those little errors and move on without recognizing it. But it's really important to find a vendor who uses RPA in a way that ensures there's more scrutiny and more security and more consistency in how work is done. So I just want to demystify that a little bit and kind of, you know, make sure folks know that it can be a really safe tool to use if you're partnering with the right vendor who has the right perspective on those types of things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lyle, for demystifying that. The next question we have is, what does bidirectional sync really mean?
I could take this one. So bidirectional sync, and I think I was probably the first one to use this term, so good question. Bidirectional sync is something that we refer to when information is flowing from the system of truth directly to what you're trying to integrate and then back in. So when it comes to APIs, you can think, we often hear there's APIs to read and there's APIs to write. We want to make sure that if we can read the information, we can also write back the information. Oftentimes we're showing what something is on file, and if an update is being made, just as you're able to see that information is being pulled, you want to know that information is being updated back as well. And I think in those cases where we have a break between what we can pull out and what we can put back in, we cause confusion for not only the end user, but also those that are incorporated into the workflow that it's helping to automate itself. So it's one way where you want to get as bidirectional as possible. We've seen many places where it is okay to not have full bidirectional, but ensure that your workflows are supporting, and those that are reaping the benefits of it fully understand the how and the why they are supposed to then utilize that integration to the best of its capability.
Makes a ton of sense. Thanks, Gabriella. And we have time for one more question here. So this audience member would like to know, we use Community Works in our hospital and Athena Health in our clinics. Are there any special considerations for us?
Yeah, I can take this one too, Gabby. I think one of the call outs I made was around flexibility, right? And working with a vendor and a partner who has high levels of flexibility. That's really important in this type of ecosystem where you have different systems that you need to integrate with. Working with a vendor who understands where the nuanced differences might be in exchanging data between two systems is very, very valuable. And I think that is a core important thing, having someone who has experience funneling data across systems that vary from customer to customer. Not just someone who says, I know this one model very well, but someone who says, the model doesn't matter. Like, we can do whatever's needed here because we understand the concepts that are involved. We understand the risks and the challenges. The risks and the challenges, I would say, probably tend to concentrate around common understandings of what data means between systems, right? Like how Community Works might represent things in your, let's say like registration side might differ very, very much so from how, your Athena Health registration information might be portrayed. Maybe it's something as simple as like your patient identifiers are different, and there's some reconciliation that happens when you're working through a third-party vendor. And they have to understand that when I get this value out of this system, well, actually, that's not the core identifier in that system. It's actually going to be like some other identifier, or I'm going to have to crosswalk to the identifier in that system. I think those types of things can be where you run into complexity and difficulty. And so searching for a vendor, searching for people you're working with in general, even within your organization, who understand how to scrutinize, basically making that data common, understanding the crosswalks and the translations and where you might get caught up on things are probably the most important things to think about when operating across different systems that make up your whole ecosystem. And they're very like easy things to tackle if you're working with the right people who understand those things and are scrutinizing it at the right level of detail that's needed.
Yeah, and calling out, having multiple source systems or even transitioning is something that is common, and it happens, and it's something that having the playbook around how do we do this in a manner that isn't going to completely upset our digital strategy that we built out. The goal should be that the patient knows no difference, whether you have two different source systems from the start or you're transitioning to a new one. You want to craft a digital experience and tool that patients see as your own one seamless system. And so I think this is going back to utilizing where your source system partners with different APIs, as we mentioned, some of those different partner programs that allow for open APIs to be utilized, as long as your vendors are verified and secure partners within that specific program. It's a key place. If you can match up API to API, you have a seamless transfer there. So wherever you can start with that as your source of truth, you'll have a great foundation and a great start, and then you can utilize some of those different options that we have there to fill the gaps, to keep the workflow the same, the experience the same, but maybe the back end just looks a little bit different.
Wonderful. Well, Lyle, Gabriella, thank you so much for your time today. We'd also like to thank Notable for sponsoring today's content. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us. Please take a moment to fill out the post-webinar survey and check out the resources on your console. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you,
us.
everyone.